Welcome to the debate. Imagine you have a massive, high-stakes project due in 30 days, right?
Like launching a startup or, I don't know, grinding out a dissertation.
Exactly. And your first instinct is probably to just, add things to your routine. You reach for more caffeine or a new nootropic stack.
Yeah, or you download some intricate time-blocking app that takes an hour just to set up.
Right. We constantly treat the human mind like this engine that just needs premium fuel poured into it so it can run faster. But what if the ultimate cognitive lever isn't something you consume? What if it is actually the deliberate withholding of your absolute strongest biological drive?
See, that completely shifts the paradigm from this modern optimization treadmill of, constantly adding things to a philosophy of radical subtraction. And it's a paradigm shift that demands serious scrutiny, honestly, because it fundamentally rewires how we manage baseline human biology.
It really does. So today, we are analyzing the pursuit of mental focus and cognitive optimization through sexual discipline. We're weighing two very distinct frameworks from the source material to answer one central question.
Right, which approach provides a superior path for achieving peak mental performance and clarity.
Exactly. And I argue that semen retention is the optimal framework. By harnessing and transmuting that raw biological drive, practitioners can manufacture this high-intensity professional and creative focus that you just absolutely need for major life sprints.
If you want genuine cognitive optimization, you have to eliminate decision fatigue entirely. You have to reset your dopamine baselines. Celibacy provides a stable, long-term peace of mind that a highly logical, deeply focused brain actually requires.
Okay, so let's lay out the architecture of semen retention first. We are not talking about simple abstinence here where you just, happen to not be having sex because you're busy.
Right, accidental abstinence isn't a practice.
Exactly. Semen retention is a deliberate, active exercise in energy management. It's about the accumulation of biological tension. Historically, ancient traditions built entire frameworks around this concept.
Yeah, like in Taoist inner alchemy.
Yes, where it's referred to as Jing, which they considered the densest form of physical energy. Or in Ayurvedic traditions, it is known as ojas. These systems didn't just view sexual fluids as reproductive material, right? They viewed the body as a closed energetic circuit.
So the mechanical theory there is that when you retain that biological potential, your central nervous system eventually reabsorbs it. And then it redirects that vitality upward toward higher order cognitive centers.
Exactly. But we have to look closely at the reality of that mechanism.
We really do, because the biology versus the psychology is a massive distinction.
For sure. And the modern psychological equivalent to that ancient concept is transmutation. By stimulating your biology, but deliberately denying it the physiological release, denying the literal evolutionary goal of the organism, you create an immense psychological pressure.
A pressure cooker, essentially.
Right. You are taking the strongest human biological urge and funneling it. It creates this hunter-like, aggressive focus. If you are executing a high-stakes endeavor, this framework provides a raw, relentless momentum that you simply cannot generate from a passive, contented state of rest.
Okay, but if we were talking about true cognitive optimization, the primary goal should never be to introduce systemic volatility into your life. True clarity requires the absolute removal of mental noise, which is precisely why celibacy is a superior protocol.
But doesn't celibacy just sweep the noise under the rug?
No, not at all. Celibacy operates not on this risky premise of energy management, but on the principle of absolute renunciation, deeply rooted in traditions like brahmacharya. It is the unequivocal abstinence from all sexual activity, partnered and solo.
Right. A total ban?
Exactly. And the reason this is critical for focus comes down to cognitive load. When you practice semen retention, you exist on this messy spectrum of maybe. You are constantly managing your arousal levels, negotiating with your own primal impulses. Celibacy moves you to a binary no.
But right, doesn't a binary no just create massive psychological repression?
Well, not if you understand the white bear effect in psychology.
Oh, Daniel Wegner stuff, right?
Exactly. Wegner's ironic process theory shows that when you try to suppress a thought while remaining engaged with the stimulus, your brain's monitoring system actually keeps that thought hyperactive in your working memory.
Trying not to think of a white bear ensures you only think of a white bear.
Precisely. Semen retention keeps the bear in the room. You're just trying really hard not to look at it. By making the choice absolute through complete celibacy, you remove the stimulus entirely. Eventually, the mind just stops searching for it. You free up a massive amount of mental bandwidth, which can then be allocated to logical thinking, complex problem solving, and sustained attention.
Okay, the problem with the white bear analogy, though, is that you are treating the biological urge to reproduce as an invasive thought that just needs to be silenced. You're ignoring that it's a potent fuel source that can be utilized.
A fuel source that is notoriously difficult to control.
Sure, but let's look at the mechanics of motivation. That primal drive is quite literally the most powerful motivator in the human operating system. Semen retention is like building a pressurized steam engine.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
The goal of a steam engine isn't to extinguish the fire, right? Extinguishing the fire is the renunciation approach. The goal is to heavily cap the boiler, let the heat rise, and channel that intense, mounting pressure into forward momentum.
But what about the risks of that pressure?
Well, if you are on what we call sprint mode, say, trying to conquer a massive creative project or an athletic milestone, you actually do not want a quiet, peaceful mind. You want a mind that is hungry, driven, and aggressively focused on acquiring the target.
Okay, your steam engine analogy actually perfectly illustrates the mechanical flaw in the semen retention framework. Think about the physics of a pressurized system. What happens to a steam engine if the release valve is faulty, or if the machinery you are trying to power isn't heavy enough to absorb that momentum?
Well, the pressure builds.
It explodes. Or at the very least, it severely degrades the internal components. The systemic risk here is massive. If we look at the clinical reality of this, building up that pressure without an immediate, highly demanding, and perfectly constructive outlet is psychological suicide for focus.
That seems a bit dramatic, don't you think?
I don't think so. That unreleased energy does not stay as clean, productive motivation. It rapidly degrades into agitation, severe irritability, and obsessive thought loops. You are introducing a highly volatile element into your neurochemistry.
But that's if you don't use it.
Right, but instead of achieving this idealized hunter-like focus, practitioners often end up destroying the very concentration they aim to enhance. Their working memory becomes entirely consumed by the frustration of unreleased tension.
Okay, but that outcome assumes the practitioner completely lacks the discipline to actively channel the energy. The transmutation factor isn't a passive state where you just sit on the couch and wait to feel productive.
But a lot of people do exactly that.
Sure, and they fail. It is an active redirection. Yes, it requires a heavy physical or creative outlet to absorb the pressure, but that is the defining feature of the protocol, not a bug. It forces productivity. It forces you to hit the gym, to write that code, to build that business, because sitting idle with that level of accumulated biological tension becomes physically and psychologically unbearable.
Just listen to the mechanism you are describing right now, though. You are using severe discomfort and physiological frustration as a whip to force productivity. That is an incredibly fragile psychological state to operate from.
It's leverage.
It's a tightrope. And if we look closely at how this frustration impacts the brain's reward system, the neurochemistry of these moods becomes highly problematic, which brings us directly to dopamine mechanics.
I am really glad you brought up dopamine, actually, because I think the neuroplasticity involved here is the absolute strongest argument for retention.
I have to push back hard on that. The dopamine mechanics of semen retention are fraught with risk because the practice allows for, and in some circles actively encourages, arousal without release. Practitioners frequently fall into behaviors like edging.
Well, edging is entirely misused.
But it's common. And if we look at the neuroscience of edging, it is a catastrophic error for cognitive performance. Let's break down tonic versus phasic dopamine. Tonic is your steady baseline, right? Phasic are the spikes you get from a reward.
Right, the peaks and valleys?
Exactly. When you edge, you are creating massive, sustained, phasic dopamine spikes, but denying the brain the physiological resolution it expects. You are keeping the autonomic nervous system in a state of high alert sympathetic arousal for hours.
Which is intense, yes.
It's damaging. What does the brain do? It protects itself by downregulating D2 receptors. You exhaust your dopamine receptors, leading to severe crashes. It completely destabilizes emotional consistency and leaves the practitioner anhedonic, just totally unable to find motivation for normal everyday tasks.
You're pointing out the absolute worst-case scenario.
I'm pointing out the reality for a lot of people. Celibacy provides a vastly superior neurochemical environment. By stepping away from the stimulus entirely, you allow the dopamine baseline to stabilize. You transition from a state of constant agitated seeking to steady, consistent serenity.
Okay, but you are focusing entirely on the pathology of poor practice. Edging is a misuse of the tool. It's a way to artificially hijack the dopamine system, which absolutely causes receptor downregulation. I agree with that.
So how do you practice it without hijacking the system?
Let's look at the mechanism of proper practice and reframe this around willpower and the prefrontal cortex. We know the prefrontal cortex governs executive function, planning, and impulse control. If you want to strengthen a muscle, you don't just rest it in a cast, right? You apply progressive overload.
Okay.
Consider these protocols as high-intensity interval training for the prefrontal cortex. Proper semen retention, especially through structured, partnered practices like Kareza or Tantra, requires the active management of arousal. But wait, those practices involve prolonged physical intimacy without climax. Doesn't that just exacerbate the exact dopamine issue I just described?
Not if executed correctly. Practices like Kareza, which focuses on affection, breathwork, and sustained physical connection without the goal of climax, they force the brain to decouple arousal from the expected dopamine spike of release.
Decoupling arousal from release?
Yes, you are actively training the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest system, to stay engaged even during high stimulation. This prevents the fight or flight sympathetic takeover that triggers climax. Every single time you experience that profound biological imperative and consciously override the impulse, you are driving neuroplasticity in the prefrontal cortex.
That's a bold claim. I argue that this continuous conscious overriding provides a vastly stronger workout for the brain's executive control center than the celibacy approach of simply hiding from the stimulus altogether.
Okay, that is a fascinating application of neuroplasticity, I'll give you that. But let's evaluate the cost of that workout. High-intensity interval training is exhausting. You cannot do high intensity all day, every day, without overtraining, spiking your cortisol, and breaking down your central nervous system.
Sure, rest is required.
The exact same principle applies to cognitive load. If you are constantly exercising your prefrontal cortex just to manage your own baseline physiological state, you are draining the very executive function you claim to be optimizing. You are spending your finite cognitive capital on internal management.
It becomes second nature, though.
Eventually, maybe. But celibacy removes this management burden entirely. You aren't fighting a war inside your own head to decouple your nervous system responses. The binary no means the prefrontal cortex isn't constantly taxed by the question of how close can I get or how do I manage this arousal?
It is only a heavy cognitive tax in the beginning stages. Like any neurological adaptation, it eventually requires less conscious effort. The overriding of the impulse becomes much more efficient. And that creates a much higher baseline of general discipline that spills over into your diet, your work ethic, your emotional regulation.
I still think the tax is too high for the reward.
But since we agree that the core mechanism here is neurological and exercise and impulse control and dopamine regulation, it fundamentally changes how we should view the physical superpowers people claim to get from this. Let's look at the biology, specifically that famous 7-day testosterone spike.
Oh, yes, we absolutely need to inject endocrinology into this because there is a massive reality check required here. A central pillar of the semen retention argument online is that holding onto physical semen provides a sustained biological upgrade, specifically a massive permanent increase in testosterone and physical vitality.
Which we know isn't exactly true.
Right. Modern endocrinology shows no robust evidence for this. Studies do indicate a temporary spike in serum testosterone around day 7 of abstinence. But why does that happen?
It's just a feedback loop.
Exactly. The hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis senses the lack of release, so it spikes luteinizing hormone to prepare for a major mating event. And when no event occurs, the body's homeostatic feedback loops kick in. It downregulates the production to conserve metabolic resources. Your levels rapidly normalize by day 8 or 9.
True.
So the physiological claims of long-term retained semen turning into a biological superpower are glaringly unfounded. The benefits practitioners report are largely driven by the placebo effect, or they are simply downstream correlations from the other positive lifestyle habits like lifting weights and eating better that usually accompany the discipline.
I completely concede the physiological limitation of the data. The 7-day testosterone spike is a transient, homeostatic event, not some permanent endocrinological upgrade. But here is the critical pivot. The biological nullity of the testosterone claim does not invalidate the practice itself.
How so?
In fact, the reality that these benefits are 90% psychological is precisely the point. The superpower isn't a magic hormone floating in the bloodstream. It is the psychological leverage of self-mastery. By consciously managing your sexuality rather than totally repressing it or compulsively indulging it, semen retention serves as a highly pragmatic middle path.
A middle path?
Yes, because we live in the modern world. Most individuals want peak ambition. They want to engage in romantic relationships, they want a family, they want drive. They don't want to live in total monastic isolation, which is what strict, lifelong celibacy ultimately demands. Semen retention leverages that psychological tension to create real-world intensity and focus without requiring you to move to a cave and renounce human connection entirely.
Okay, but a middle path implies that the practitioner's baseline is already balanced. But for the modern individual, particularly those coming from a state of constant algorithm-driven overstimulation, a middle path is clinically the wrong starting point.
Why is it the wrong starting point?
If your dopamine receptors are fried from the modern landscape of high-speed internet and instant sexual gratification, trying to manage that energy through semen retention is like trying to hear a whisper in a crowded nightclub. You don't need a hearing aid, you need to leave the club entirely.
Right, a dopamine detox.
Exactly. That is what a strict 30 to 90-day celibacy reset accomplishes. It turns off the music so your brain's receptors can actually recalibrate. You have to establish a foundation of peace first. You must heal the dopaminergic pathways and remove the entire game of sexual pursuit from your psychology before any sort of complex transmutation can be safely or effectively attempted.
That makes sense for a reboot.
Right. True clarity demands a complete reset, not a sophisticated management strategy layered on top of a broken system.
But notice the phrasing you just used, before any sort of transmutation can be safely attempted. You are acknowledging that the 90-day celibacy period is essentially a medical intervention. It is a baseline calibration for a depleted system.
I am.
I agree with that application. But a temporary reset is not the ultimate optimized state for someone who wants to conquer complex, high-stakes challenges in the real world. Once that baseline is healed and the receptors are functioning properly, you transition to the retention framework to add that fire back into the equation. You use celibacy to heal, but you use semen retention to perform.
I firmly disagree that peace is merely a stepping stone to intensity. For many high performers, that quiet clarity, that absolute freedom from the relentless biological push and pull, is the ultimate optimized state.
But where does the drive come from then?
It comes from a stable, rational pursuit of goals. Why invite the fire back into the house once you've finally stopped it from burning the furniture? Think about the cognitive advantages of long-term celibacy, emotional stability, the freedom from external interpersonal stressors, the elimination of relationship-related anxieties and time sinks.
Those are real benefits, sure.
They are massive. These aren't temporary crutches for a depleted brain. They are the hallmarks of a profoundly optimized, highly logical mind that can sustain deep attention on long-term goals for decades, not just burn brightly during a brief aggressive sprint.
Well, we are clearly arriving at a fundamental philosophical divergence regarding what optimization actually looks like. So to summarize my position, I maintain that semen retention remains the optimal tool for the modern strategist, the athlete, or the entrepreneur. If your life demands a surge of raw intensity, if you need that aggressive forward-moving focus for worldly, high-stakes pursuits, the active management and psychological transmutation of our deepest biological drive is an absolutely unmatched cognitive lever.
And I maintain that celibacy offers the vastly superior, more sustainable framework. True cognitive optimization is found in the removal of mental clutter. By stepping entirely out of the sexual negotiation, you eliminate decision fatigue, protect your dopamine receptors from volatile phasic spikes and crashes, and achieve a baseline of emotional stability and mental serenity that erratic, high-tension practices simply cannot offer.
Despite that deep divergence on methodology, I think there is a very clear point of convergence here. We both acknowledge that the physical act itself, whether that is the deliberate retention of physical fluids or the total renunciation of the act entirely, is ultimately just the vehicle.
Precisely. The mindset of intention is the actual engine. The primary mechanism granting practitioners these profound benefits isn't ancient magic or, biological alchemy. It is the rigorous neurological strengthening of the prefrontal cortex and the stabilization of the dopamine reward system.
Exactly.
If you approach either practice with the wrong psychological framework, say an obsessive, ego-driven pride and semen retention, or a resentful, white-knuckling suppression in celibacy, you will achieve neither focus nor peace.
Beautifully said. And we would be remiss if we didn't point out the grounding truth beneath all of this. These protocols are powerful psychological levers, absolutely. But they are secondary interventions. They really must be built on top of evidence-based fundamentals.
Sleep, diet, exercise.
Right. If you are not engaging in deep work, if your diet is poor, if you aren't meditating, if you are chronically sleep-deprived, neither of these practices will save you from cognitive decline. There is just so much more to explore in how we manage the foundations of our biology before we even touch these advanced protocols.
The optimization treadmill continues. We've just turned it in a different, vastly more introspective direction.
Indeed, we have. We started this discussion by comparing the mind to an engine, debating whether it is better to cap the steam and build immense pressure, or to let the fire die down so the machinery can cool and run with frictionless precision. It is a dilemma that doesn't yield a single universal victor, but rather asks the practitioner to look honestly at their own life's demands.
Exactly. Are you seeking a surge of aggressive energy to conquer the world around you, or the quiet, sustained clarity to understand your place within it?
A question that requires no immediate answer, only deep consideration. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.